I want you to understand something before I go any further. I'm not a believer. I wasn't raised on campfire stories or cryptid forums. I spent 6 seasons working trail surveys in the North Cascades, sleeping under tarps, drinking snowmelt, and marking coordinates with a pencil and a compass because half the canyons up there swallow radio signals like stones. I knew those mountains the way you know the rooms of your childhood home, by feel, by memory, by the particular slant of light through old-growth hemlock just before the sun drops behind the ridge. But on the 18th of April, 2003, something happened that I still cannot square with the world I thought I understood. It was an early thaw that year. The snowpack had hung on through March, dense and rotten, and then a warm Pacific front blew in and turned the high country into a minefield. Water was moving under the snow in channels you couldn't see, carving voids, undermining everything. I was up near an old logging spur between Marble Mount and New Halem, updating trail conditions for the Forest Service, when I heard it, a low, groaning crack, like the mountain clearing its throat. I turned just in time to see the hillside above me fracture. It wasn't a wall of snow. It was worse. It was a churning avalanche of thaw slush, windfall timber, and pulverized ice rolling down through a gully choked with dead fir. The blast of displaced air hit me first, cold, sharp, full of needles and bark, and then the leading edge caught my legs and flipped me sideways into a tangle of roots and stone. I remember the sound of my own breath, high and thin, and the weight of a fallen log pinning my chest against the ledge. Below me, the creek roared, swollen fat with snowmelt the color of old iron. Above me, the sky was dimming to that particular shade of alpine blue that means you have maybe 20 minutes of usable light left, and then the cold comes down like a hammer. I tried to move. The log didn't care. I tried to breathe deep. My ribs screamed, and then I saw him. He stepped out of the white haze of settling snow and splintered wood, silent, massive, and utterly calm, not stumbling, not startled, deliberate. He moved the way a bear moves through shallow water, efficient, unbothered by the physics that would break a man. I could not see his face clearly in the failing light, but I saw his shape, broad across the shoulders in a way that made my brain stutter, because nothing that wide should move on 2 legs. His arms were long, thick as my torso, and when he reached down and gripped the log that was pinning me, I heard the wood creak. He lifted it, not with a jerk or a heave, just a steady, controlled pull, angling it up and back just enough for me to drag myself free. I gasped, rolled onto my side, and when I looked up again, he was already stepping back into the tree line. No roar, no display, just a shadow against the darkening firs, and then nothing. I lay there on the ledge, shaking, my chest burning, my mouth full of dirt and adrenaline. My field notebook, a battered canvas-covered journal I kept in my chest pocket, was resting on my sternum. I hadn't pulled it out. It had been knocked loose in the slide, and he had placed it back, deliberately, like returning something that mattered. I didn't tell anyone, not that night, and not the next morning when I limped back down to the spur road and radioed in my report. What was I supposed to say? That I'd been saved by something I couldn't name? That I'd seen a man who wasn't a man lift a log that would have taken 3 people and a pry bar? But 2 days later, when I went back up to finish the survey, I found something waiting for me. Tucked beneath the shoulder strap of my pack, right where I'd left it leaning against a stump, was a smooth river stone, quartz, pale and worn, small enough to fit in my palm. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it, and 50 yards up the trail, my survey ribbons, the bright orange plastic strips I'd tied to mark the route, had been moved, not torn down, rearranged. They formed a loose spiral around the trunk of an old cedar, deliberate and slow, like someone had taken the time to spell something out in a language I didn't speak. I stood there in the cold morning light, turning the stone over in my hand, and felt the first prickling edge of a question I didn't want to ask. What did he want in return? There's a woman in Rockport. I won't use her name, but she's been there longer than the paved roads, who used to sell firewood and jam out of a corrugated tin shed off the North Cascades Highway. I stopped there on my way back into town, bought a jar of blackberry preserves, and asked her as casually as I could if she'd ever heard stories about the mountains. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You mean the old people?" I nodded. She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter. "My grandfather used to say they move at dusk, that they trade breath for silence." She said it the way you'd recite a recipe. Matter of fact. No drama. If one of them pulls you out of something, you don't talk about it. You just live different after. Different how? She shrugged. Quieter. You stop leaving gates open. You stop telling people where to go. I paid for the jam and left, but her words stuck to me like pitch. You live different after. 3 weeks later, I heard about the hunter. A man from Concrete had rolled his Ford pickup on a gravel switchback during a late-season storm. The road was sick with runoff, and he clipped the edge trying to avoid a washout. The truck went over, flipped once, and came to rest on its side against a lone ponderosa pine. He walked away with a sprained wrist and a story he told to anyone who'd listen. A shadow had braced the truck as it slid. He swore it. Said he felt the whole vehicle shudder and settle, like something had caught it mid-roll and eased it down instead of letting it tumble into the ravine. When he crawled out through the passenger window, he found prints in the slick clay beside the tree, 5-toed, deep, with a stride longer than any man could manage, the toes splayed wide like the split heart of a cedar. I drove up there on my day off. The truck had already been towed, but the prints were still there, softened by rain, but unmistakable. I knelt beside them, measuring the span with my hand, and that's when I saw it. Another quartz pebble, sitting in the center of the deepest track like an egg in a nest. I picked it up. Smooth, river-worn, identical to the first. And I understood, with a cold certainty that settled in my gut, that I was not the only one. That night, I spread out my trail maps on the floor of my rental cabin and started marking locations. The avalanche, the rollover. I added a third, a wildfire jump site from the summer before where a hotshot crew had found an impossible corridor through a crown fire and credited good instincts. I added a fourth, a backcountry skier pulled from a tree well after 2 days, found by a ranger who said he'd followed a feeling and some tracks that disappeared halfway up the slope. Every incident was within 20 miles of the same drainage. Every survivor had gone quiet afterward, not traumatized, just reserved. They stopped posting their routes online. They turned down interviews. One of them took a job with the County Road Commission. Another became a volunteer with search and rescue and started filing noise complaints against off-road tours. They were being chosen, and now so was I. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to be part of whatever pattern was taking shape in those mountains. But I also couldn't ignore the fact that I was alive, because something had decided I was worth saving. So I did the only thing that felt right. I went back to the cedar where the ribbons had been spiraled, and I left an offering on a flat stump at the mouth of the draw. Smoked salmon jerky, 2 apples, and a handful of sunflower seeds. Not to lure, not to provoke, just to say thank you, in the only language I had. I didn't expect an answer. But 3 days later, when I returned, the food was gone, and in its place was a folded packet of oilskin, old and stained, tied with a loop of salmon sinew. Inside, I found 3 things: a Polaroid photograph, faded and creased, showing a washed-out Forest Service bridge swaying above white water. 2 figures stood in the spray, blurred but unmistakably human. A clipping from a county newspaper, yellowed with age, dated 1979. The headline read, "Miraculous Survival in Winter Slide, Hiker Found Alive After 4 Days." And a single sprig of cedar, green and fresh, tied with a knot I didn't recognize. I sat there in the dirt, holding the packet in my hand, and felt the weight of something much larger than gratitude. This wasn't a gift. It was an invitation. Over the next 2 months, I started paying attention in a way I never had before. I noticed when a trail closure got extended without explanation. I noticed when a logging spur was quietly decommissioned, the gate chained and overgrown as if it had always been that way. I noticed when a county roads supervisor happened to reassign my seasonal contract to cover a network of trails that skirted the most sensitive basins, places where the old growth still stood thick and the creeks ran clear. One morning, I found a replacement parcel map in my mailbox. No note, no return address. Someone had crossed out an unmarked easement in blue pencil, clean and permanent, and that easement happened to cut straight through the drainage where I'd been rescued. I showed it to a ranger I knew from Darrington, a man who'd been in the Cascades for 30 years. He glanced at it, handed it back, and said, very quietly, "Sometimes the woods move, and sometimes it's our job to pretend we didn't see." He didn't say anything else, and I didn't ask. The second time he saved me, I was alone on a ridge trail during a lightning bust in late July. The storm came in fast, the way they do when the mountains trap heat and wring it out in violence. I'd been marking hazard trees, snags weakened by beetle kill, when the sky split open. A lodgepole pine 50 yards upslope took a direct hit, and the top sheared off in a spray of sparks and steam. I heard it coming before I saw it, a whistling crack, the air splitting, and I froze. The broken top was falling straight toward me, 20 feet of jagged timber spinning through smoke and ozone, and I had nowhere to go. The trail was narrow, carved into a rock face on one side and open air on the other. He stepped between us. I don't know where he came from. One moment the sky was full of fire and falling wood, and the next there was a shape, broad, solid, impossibly fast, and the broken top slammed into his shoulder instead of my skull. He took the blow without a sound, caught the weight across his forearm, and lowered it to the ground as if he were setting down a child. Then he turned and looked at me. I saw his eyes for the first time. Dark, deep-set, calm. He held my gaze for 3 seconds, long enough for me to understand that this was not an accident, not a coincidence, not a mistake. And then he stepped back into the smoke and was gone. At my feet, pressed into the wet ash, was another quartz pebble, and beside it, half buried, was a curled and charred corner of a photograph. Just a fragment, part of a face. A woman, smiling, the edge of a wooden bridge. I picked it up with shaking hands and understood that I was no longer just a witness. I was part of the ledger. That night, I went back to the offering stump. This time, the packet waiting for me was larger, wrapped in oilskin and tied with braided bark. Inside were dozens of items: newspaper clippings, hand-sketched weather maps, Polaroids from 3 different decades. Every one of them documented a rescue, a slide, a flood, a fire, a fall, and every one of them was annotated in the margins with pictographs I didn't recognize, simple marks that looked like hands, trees, gates, roads. I spread them out on the stump and started piecing it together. Every person who had been saved appeared in the archive, and beside each name, printed or written in faded ink, was a record of what came after: a trail closure signed off 2 years later, a permit rescinded, a signpost that went missing, a logging spur mysteriously decommissioned, a lost survey that redirected traffic away from a sensitive basin. They weren't random acts of gratitude, they were investments. These rescues weren't about kindness. They were about leverage, about placing the right people in the right positions to quietly reshape the map, one signature, one closure, one accident at a time. And now I was one of them. I sat there in the growing dark, the wind moving through the cedars like a long exhale, and felt the weight of a question I could no longer avoid. What would I be asked to do? The answer came sooner than I expected, and it would cost me more than I knew. The test didn't announce itself with thunder or a vision. It came the way most turning points do, quietly, in pieces, over the course of a single summer that felt like crossing a border I couldn't see. It started with the poacher. I found his setup in early August, tucked into a game trail near the northern edge of the basin I'd been reassigned to monitor. A bait pile, rotting apples and stale bread mixed with anise oil, hidden under a tarp weighted with river stones. 30 feet downslope, a wire snare anchored to a young alder set low and tight, built for legs, not necks. It was illegal on every level. The basin was closed to hunting. The snare itself was a felony, and the bait pile sat less than 200 yards from a spring seep that I knew because I had been watching, because I had been taught to watch, was a water source for more than deer. I stood there in the dappled morning light, looking at the frayed steel cable, and felt the weight of a choice I hadn't asked for. I could report it. That was the right thing, the legal thing, the thing I'd been trained to do. But reporting meant investigators, meant foot traffic, meant maps pulled and coordinates logged, and maybe, probably, a follow-up survey that would grid out every inch of the drainage, including the cedar draw I'd been quietly steering people away from for months. Or I could handle it myself, quietly, the way the others in the ledger had learned to do. I pulled out my notepad and wrote down the plate number from the mud-spattered pickup truck I'd seen parked at the trailhead that morning, a white Chevy, Idaho tags, a gun rack in the rear window. Then I hiked back down, drove into Marble Mount, and called it in to a deputy I knew from a bar in Concrete. I didn't mention the location. I just said I'd seen someone acting strange near a closed zone, gave him the plate, and suggested he might want to check the registration for priors. The truck was gone by the next afternoon. The bait pile stayed where it was, untouched, until the ravens picked it apart. No one came to investigate. No one asked me questions. The game trail stayed quiet, and 2 weeks later I found a new quartz pebble sitting on the stump where I left my reports. I picked it up, turned it over in my palm, and felt the sickening clarity of understanding I had passed the first test. The second test came in the form of a prospector. He wasn't local. I could tell that from the way he'd set up his camp, a nylon dome tent in electric blue, visible from half a mile away, pitched on a gravel bar in the middle of a tributary that fed straight into the salmon run. He'd built a crude sluice box out of 2x4s and window screen, and he was running stream bed through it, piling rocks and silt on the bank like he had every right. I watched him from the ridge above for 20 minutes, my jaw tight, my hands curled into fists. The creek wasn't huge, but it was clean, cold, and full of spawning cutthroat. The sluice was dumping sediment back into the current, clouding the water, smothering the gravel beds where the fish laid their eggs. In 2 weeks, he could collapse a season's worth of reproduction. In a month, he could kill the run. I could call it in. Forest Service enforcement would roll up in a few days, issue a citation, maybe impound his gear. But enforcement meant documentation, meant a case file, meant the drainage got flagged in a database somewhere as a problem area, which meant more patrols, more eyes, more people asking why a seasonal trail tech cared so much about one bootleg prospector. Or I could take care of it myself. I waited until dusk. Then I hiked down, dismantled the sluice, and dragged the frame 200 yards downstream, wedging it under a log jam where the current would bury it in silt by morning. I scattered his rock piles, smoothed the gravel bar, and poured a canteen of water over his fire pit until it was cold and dark. I didn't touch his tent. I didn't take anything. I just erased his impact, the way a flood would, the way the forest does when you're not looking. He was gone by noon the next day. I never saw him again, but 3 days later I found a second quartz pebble on the stump, and beside it a small bundle wrapped in cedar bark. Inside was a single salmon vertebra, cleaned and dried, strung on a loop of braided grass. A gift, a confirmation. I was learning the language. The third test was harder because it involved people I knew. A surveying crew showed up in late August, contracted by a timber company, exploring the edges of a sale that had been stalled in appeals for 5 years. They were flagging a corridor, a straight line of bright pink tape, that cut through a second-growth buffer and pointed like an arrow toward the cedar amphitheater I'd been visiting, the place where the ribbons had been spiraled, the place I knew in my bones was not meant to be found. I met the crew chief at the trailhead. His name was Randall, and he was a decent man, tired, methodical, just doing his job. He showed me the map, explained the corridor, asked if I knew of any hazards. I looked at the line he'd drawn. It passed within 300 yards of the amphitheater. I told him the truth, in a way, that the drainage was prone to blowdowns, that a spring windstorm had dropped a dozen widowmakers across the access trail, and that the Forest Service was planning to decommission the whole spur by October for public safety. None of that was true, but Randall didn't have time to verify it. He had 3 other sites to survey before the snow came, and this one was already behind schedule. He looked at me, looked at the map, and sighed. "You'll file the report?" "I'll file it," I said. He packed up his flags and left. That afternoon, I hiked into the corridor and pulled every piece of tape. I rolled them into a tight ball, carried them out in my pack, and burned them in a fire pit behind my cabin. Then I wrote up a hazard report citing wind throw, unstable snags, and unsafe access conditions, and I submitted it through the county system with a recommendation for closure. The corridor disappeared from the database. The timber sale stalled again, and when I returned to the amphitheater 2 weeks later, I found a new arrangement waiting for me on the stone shelf where the objects were kept. 3 pink survey flags folded and stacked like a deck of cards with a single raven's feather laid across them. He had been watching. He knew. I started dreaming about him. Not nightmares. Something stranger. I would be walking through the forest, following a trail I didn't recognize, and I'd hear the sound of a drum, deep, resonant, a heartbeat in the earth. And when I turned toward it, I'd see him standing at the edge of a clearing, his back to me, his shoulders rising and falling with breath. He never turned around. He never spoke. But I knew in the dream that he was waiting for something, and I knew that I was running out of time to deliver it. The fire came in September. It started as 2 separate burns, a lightning strike on a ridge above Cascade Pass and another in the Sauk drainage, but a dry east wind pushed them together in less than 48 hours, and by the time the evacuation started, the complex was burning hot and fast, crowning through the canopy, throwing embers a mile ahead of the front. I was pulled in as a volunteer lookout runner, part of a skeleton crew coordinating between the incident command post and the crews on the ground. We had radios, but the smoke was playing hell with the signals, and half the roads in the network were dirt spurs that hadn't been updated on the maps since the 1980s. That's how the bus got lost. It was carrying 16 people, residents from a small assisted living home near Rockport, evacuated at the last minute when the wind shifted and the fire jumped a road. The driver was a volunteer, a man in his 60s who'd lived in the valley his whole life, but the smoke had turned the world into a wall of rust and shadow, and he missed the turn onto the safe spur. Instead, he kept driving north, deeper into the canyon, toward a section of road that dead-ended at a washout no one had bothered to sign. I heard the call on my handheld VHF just after 3 in the afternoon, garbled, desperate, a man's voice shouting over static, "We're lost! Smoke everywhere! Can't see the road!" I grabbed the county map and tried to trace his route, but the roads didn't match. Too many decommissioned spurs, too many closures that weren't marked. My hands were shaking. I radioed back, asked for landmarks. Anything, nothing. Just the hiss of dead air and the distant roar of wind through fire. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran up the ridge trail that paralleled the canyon, my lungs burning, my vision narrowing to the rhythm of my boots on stone. The smoke was so thick I could taste it, bitter and chemical, and the light had gone orange, then red, then the color of a bruise, and then I heard it, the drum, deep, rhythmic, not loud but felt, a pulse that moved through the ground and into my chest like standing too close to a speaker. It repeated, 4 beats, a pause, 4 beats, not random, a pattern. I stopped, gasping, and turned toward the sound. Upslope, barely visible through the smoke, I saw him. He was standing on the spine of an old dozer line, a scar from a fire that had burned 20 years ago, a strip of bare earth that hadn't grown back. He raised one arm slowly and pointed west. I followed his line. 50 yards down the slope, I saw them, quartz pebbles, placed at intervals along the dozer line like runway lights, each one catching the weird ember glow and shining pale against the ash. A path. I ran. The bus was stopped at a junction 200 yards from a glow that whispered of flashover, the moment when the air itself ignites. The driver had his head in his hands. The passengers were pressed against the windows, faces pale and slick with sweat. I banged on the door, shouted, pointed, "Follow me, now!" The driver looked up, saw my vest, and moved. I led them down the dozer line, my radio barking static, the heat building behind us like a hand pressing on my back. The quartz pebbles marked the turns, the safe angles, the places where the ground was stable. I didn't question it. I just followed. We hit the safe spur 20 minutes later, the road wide and clear, the wind shifting enough to pull the smoke east. Fire engines were already staged at the intersection. The passengers stumbled off the bus, coughing and crying and holding each other, and the driver grabbed my shoulder and said, "How did you know?" I didn't answer, because when I turned back toward the ridge, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards off, his fur ash-dusted gray, his eyes reflecting the ember light like coins. He raised one hand, not to wave, not to signal, but to mark, to say, "Remember." Then he turned and walked back into the smoke, and the forest swallowed him whole. The county called it a lucky reroute. The news praised the driver's instincts. The passengers wrote thank-you letters to the Volunteer Coordination Office, and I was copied on everyone. 2 weeks later, I was offered a permanent job, Hazard Assessment Coordinator, with authority to recommend closures, reroutes, and emergency access restrictions across the entire district. I accepted. And that same week, I received a package in the mail. No return address, no postmark I recognized. Inside was a laminated evacuation map, updated and clean, with one road inked over in blue pencil, a spur that led into the Cedar Amphitheater Basin. It had been erased. Officially. Permanently. I spread the map on my table and stared at it until the light faded and the room went dark. I had passed the test, but I was beginning to understand the cost. That night, I went back to the amphitheater. The quartz pebbles were still there, arranged on the stone shelf alongside the other objects, the raven's feather, the folded flags, the salmon vertebra. But now there was something new, a photograph, whole, unburned. It was the woman from the fragment I'd found in the ash, smiling, standing beside a wooden footbridge, her hand resting on the rail. And on the back, in blue pencil, someone had drawn a simple map, a ridge, a basin, a circle. The amphitheater. I turned the photo over again and looked at her face, and I realized, with a cold and certain dread, that I knew her story. She'd been part of the ledger, too. One of the rescues from the 1970s. A trail volunteer who'd later become a county planner, who'd quietly killed 3 development projects and rerouted a highway extension. She'd lived different after, just like I would. I knelt there in the amphitheater, the photo in my hands, and felt the weight of every choice I'd made since the avalanche. The poacher, the prospector, the survey flags, the road I'd erased, the people I'd saved. I wasn't being forced, I was being invested in, and the returns were starting to come due. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the reach of my headlamp, I heard the drum again. Slow, steady, 4 beats, a pause, 4 beats, a heartbeat, a reminder. I wasn't alone in these mountains anymore. I was part of something older, quieter, and far more patient than I'd ever imagined. And the next time he called, I knew I would answer. The invitation came without words. It was mid-October, the air sharp with the smell of dying alder and wet stone, when I found the trail. Not a new trail. I'd walked past the spot a dozen times, but a gap in the brush I'd never noticed before, a space between 2 nurse logs that opened onto a narrow deer path threading upslope through a cathedral of old-growth cedar. At the entrance, placed on a flat stone still warm from the afternoon sun, was a quartz pebble and a sprig of fresh cedar tied with grass. I stood there for a long time, my pack heavy on my shoulders, my breath fogging in the cold. Every instinct I'd honed over 6 seasons told me to mark the location, to document, to map. But a deeper instinct, the one I'd been learning all summer, told me to do the opposite. So I pocketed the pebble, left my GPS unit in the truck, and followed the path. The forest changed as I climbed. The undergrowth thinned. The light took on a greenish aquarium quality, filtered through layers of canopy so dense I couldn't see the sky. The cedars were enormous, their trunks wide as truck beds, their bark hanging in long strips like torn cloth. Some of them had to be 500 years old, maybe more, and woven between them, so subtly I almost missed it, was a lattice of broken branches and bent saplings, crisscrossed and interlaced 30 feet overhead, breaking the sight lines from above. It wasn't natural. It was deliberate camouflage against satellites, against aerial surveys, against the drone hobbyists who'd started buzzing the wilderness areas with cheap cameras looking for content. I thought about the year 2003. The technology was new, but not new enough that something, hadn't already adapted. The path ended at the amphitheater. I'd been there before, of course. I'd left offerings on the stump, collected the quartz pebbles, studied the objects on the stone shelf. But I'd always come at dusk, always kept to the edges, always left quickly. This time, I'd been invited deeper. The amphitheater was a natural bowl carved into the hillside, ringed by ancient cedars and floored with soft moss that swallowed sound. In the center was the stone shelf I knew. But now I saw more, a second shelf behind it, and a third, each one stacked with objects that told a story I was only beginning to understand. I walked slowly, reverently, letting my eyes adjust. On the first shelf, bird nests, fallen and repaired with bark fiber, a child's wool glove, faded red, from the early 1990s, a bent camp spoon with a hand-carved handle, fish vertebrae strung on reed, a Forest Service badge, dulled with age and weather, the pin rusted through. I recognized the style, 1980s issue. On the second shelf, photographs, dozens of them, Polaroids and drugstore prints arranged in overlapping rows, faces I didn't know, places I did, the wooden footbridge, the washed-out road, the ridge above Cascade Pass, each one documenting a moment, a rescue, a turning point. And on the third shelf, carved into the stone itself, glyphs. I knelt in the moss and traced them with my fingers, concentric spirals, radiating lines, repeated marks that looked like hands, 5 fingers, then 4, then 3. A countdown. Beside them, symbols I recognized from wildfire maps, triangles for snags, wavy lines for water, clusters of dots for burn scars, and at the center of the largest glyph, a circle within a circle, and inside that, a single deep gouge. Home. I sat back on my heels, my chest tight, and understood what I was looking at. This wasn't a shrine. It wasn't a museum. It was a ledger, a map, a record of everything they'd been doing for decades, maybe longer, tracking the erosion of their world and learning piece by piece how to slow it down using the only tools that worked, us. I don't know how long I sat there, long enough for the light to shift, long enough to hear the forest settle into its evening rhythms, the chatter of squirrels, the distant knocking of a pileated woodpecker, the whisper of wind through cedar boughs. And then I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the upslope side of the amphitheater where the shadows pooled thick and dark. I stood, my heart hammering, and turned. He stepped into the clearing. I'd seen him before, in smoke, in twilight, in the fractured chaos of disasters. But never like this, never still, never close. He was enormous, 7 feet, maybe more, his shoulders broad enough to block the trail behind him. His fur was a dark auburn, streaked with silver across the chest and arms, and it moved with his breathing, slow and deep. His face was flat, almost human, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Too wide, too heavy in the brow, the eyes too knowing. He stopped 10 feet from me and watched. I forced myself to breathe, to stay still, to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark brown, flecked with amber, and they held an intelligence that made my stomach drop. Not animal cunning, not instinct, thought, assessment. The same look a surgeon gives a wound or an engineer gives a cracked foundation. He was deciding whether I understood. I swallowed hard and did the only thing I could think of. I placed my hand on my chest, then gestured to the stone shelves, then to the ground. I see, I understand, I'm listening. He tilted his head just slightly, and then he moved. He walked to the second shelf, his gait smooth and eerily quiet for something his size, and picked up one of the photographs. He held it up, angled toward the fading light so I could see. It was the woman from the footbridge, the one who'd become a county planner, the one who'd killed the development projects. He set it down and picked up another, a man in a ranger's uniform standing beside a trail closure sign. I recognized the location, a drainage that had been decommissioned in the mid-90s, turned into a de facto wildlife corridor. Another, a younger woman in a flannel shirt and work gloves, smiling beside a pile of removed survey stakes. He set each one down carefully, deliberately, building a row. Then he turned to the third shelf and pointed at the glyphs, the concentric circles, the countdown marks, the symbol for home. He touched the stone, then touched his chest. Then he pointed at me. This is ours. You are part of this now. I nodded, my throat dry. He watched me for a long moment, then turned and walked to the far edge of the amphitheater. He knelt, slowly, his joints creaking, and began digging in the soft earth with his hands. I stood frozen, unsure whether to move, to help, to leave. But he glanced back at me once, a clear invitation, so I walked over and knelt beside him. He unearthed a bundle. It was wrapped in oilskin, old and brittle, tied with rotting cordage. He opened it carefully, peeling back the layers, and inside were more objects. A compass from the 1940s, the brass green with verdigris, a hand-drawn map on surveyor's linen, the ink faded to ghost lines, a tin canteen, dented and dry, a leather diary, swollen with moisture and age, the pages stuck together. He laid them out between us like cards in a hand, then pointed at the diary. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and carefully peeled it open. The first legible entry was dated June 1942. Saw him again today near the upper fork. Didn't run this time. Left the venison haunch where he could find it. Don't know why I'm doing this. Don't know what I expect. But after what happened on the slide, I figure I owe him something. I flipped forward, the pages fragile as ash. Roads getting pushed through whether I like it or not. Told the crew the grade's too steep, but they don't listen. Told 'em about the elk calving ground, and they laughed. So I did what I could. Moved the survey stakes 200 yards north. No one noticed. Road curves now, misses the meadow. Small thing, but maybe it matters. Another entry, months later. Found another one like me. Woman from Darrington says something pulled her out of the river last spring. She's got the same look I do now. Quiet. Careful. We didn't talk much. Didn't need to. She's working the county planning office. Says she'll do what she can. The last entry I could read was dated 1947. I think I finally understand. They're not asking for worship, not asking for proof. They're asking for time, just enough time to slip through the cracks we leave in the map. And if I have to spend the rest of my life widening those cracks, so be it. I owe him that much. I closed the diary and set it down gently. My hands were shaking. My vision was blurred. I looked up at him, and he was watching me with that same calm, patient expression. "How many?" I whispered. "How many of us have there been?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached into the bundle and pulled out one more object, a small leather pouch cinched with a drawstring. He opened it and poured the contents into his palm. Quartz pebbles, dozens of them, smooth and pale, glowing faintly in the dusk. He held them out toward me, then closed his hand and pointed at the glyphs on the stone. The countdown, 5, 4, 3. Time is running out. He stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and gestured for me to follow. We walked to the northern edge of the amphitheater, where the cedars thinned and the ground dropped away into a steep ravine. He pointed down into the shadows, and I followed his line. At first, I didn't see it. Then my eyes adjusted, and I realized what I was looking at. Stumps, dozens of them scattered across the ravine floor like broken teeth, cut flat and pale, the growth rings tight and ancient. They'd been logged decades ago, maybe longer, but the scar was still there, raw and permanent, hidden from the trails and the roads, but impossible to miss if you knew where to look. He touched my shoulder, then pointed at the amphitheater behind us, then at the stumps below. The message was clear. This is what we're trying to prevent. We stood there in the cold and the silence, and I felt the weight of every choice I'd made since the avalanche settled onto my shoulders like a pack full of stones. I thought about the poacher, the prospector, the survey flags, the road I'd erased, the bus I'd saved, and I thought about the 1940s diary, the quiet acts of sabotage and subterfuge, the constellation of people across decades who'd chosen silence over recognition, who'd weaponized their gratitude into policy, who'd learned to move roads and close gates and misplace keys because it was the only language that worked. I turned to him, and he was still watching me. "What do you need?" I asked. He didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. He reached into a pouch at his side, woven from cedar bark worn smooth with age, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me. I unfolded it carefully. It was a map, hand-drawn, recent, the ink still dark. It showed the drainage, the basin, the amphitheater, and 3 marked locations in red. The first was labeled in simple pictographs, a snare, a trap. The second, a flag, a survey corridor. The third, a road, a new spur, proposed but not yet built, cutting straight through the heart of the basin. He pointed at each one in turn, then at me. "These are the next tests." I folded the map and slipped it into my chest pocket next to my field notebook. "I'll take care of it," I said. He held my gaze for a long moment, then placed his hand on his chest, and then on mine, a gesture so gentle, so deliberate, it nearly broke me. "Thank you." Then he turned and walked back into the shadows. his footsteps silent, his shape dissolving into the forest like smoke into air. I stood there alone in the amphitheater until the stars came out and the cold bit through my jacket. Then I walked back down the trail, the map burning against my ribs, the weight of the ledger pressing into my chest. I had been chosen. I had been tested. And now I had been trusted. But the hardest part was still to come, because the people I was about to lie to, the systems I was about to manipulate, the maps I was about to redraw, they were mine, my world, my species, and I was choosing, knowingly and deliberately, to betray them, not for money, not for fame, but because I owed a debt I could never repay, and because, deep down, I believed he was right. The rain came early that year. By November, the mountains were drowning. The snowpack that should have been building was washing away in warm Pacific storms, and the rivers swelled dark and fast, chewing at their banks, pulling down alders and undermining roads. The ground was saturated, unstable, ready to move. I spent most of that month doing exactly what I'd been trusted to do. The first location on the map, the snare, I handled the same way I'd handled the poacher. I found it set near a game trail above the basin, documented the setup with photographs I never filed, and called in an anonymous tip to Fish and Wildlife with a vehicle description and a time frame. The snare disappeared. No one asked questions. The second location, the survey corridor, took more work. A new crew had been contracted, different company, and they'd already flagged a preliminary route that skirted the basin's eastern edge. I met with the crew chief, a woman named Angela, who wore her competence like armor, and I fed her the same story I'd used before. Unstable slopes, recent debris flows, high avalanche risk. I showed her a hazard map I'd drawn myself, full of authoritative red zones and credible-sounding terrain classifications. She looked at the map, looked at me, and then she asked the question I'd been dreading. Who verified this? I did, I said. It's based on field observations from last spring and updated USGS data. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't exactly the truth either. She studied the map for another long moment, then folded it and handed it back. I'll recommend a reroute, she said, but I'm noting your name on the report. That's fine, I said. It wasn't fine, but it was done. The flags came down. The corridor shifted south, away from the basin, and when I returned to the amphitheater the following week, I found a single raven's feather laid across the stone shelf, black and glossy. Perfect. 2 down, 1 to go. The third location was the hardest. The proposed road, a spur extension meant to service a new recreational trailhead, was already in the county's 5-year transportation plan. It had funding, it had momentum, and it cut straight through the drainage, bisecting the basin and opening a corridor that would funnel weekend hikers, trail runners, and adventure photographers directly into the heart of the refuge I'd been quietly protecting for months. I couldn't stop it with a phone call. I couldn't stall it with a hazard report. I needed to kill it, permanently. And I needed to do it in a way that wouldn't raise alarms or invite scrutiny. So I did what people in the ledger had been doing for decades. I became invisible, and I moved the map. It started small, a misplaced file, a copied permit with a transposed parcel number, a meeting invitation sent to the wrong department, causing a 2-week delay, an environmental assessment that mysteriously required a second round of public comment. I didn't do all of it myself. I didn't need to. The system was already slow, already fragmented, already vulnerable to the kind of small, plausible errors that cascade into months of bureaucratic paralysis. I just gave it a nudge, and while the project stalled, I worked the other side. I contacted a conservation nonprofit I knew from a previous season and told them, truthfully, that the proposed road would fragment a critical wildlife corridor. I didn't mention Sasquatch. I didn't mention debts or ledgers or ancient compacts. I talked about elk, about salamanders, about soil erosion and stream temperature, and the quiet collapse of ecosystems that happens one road at a time. They filed an appeal, then a lawsuit. The county pushed back. The timber company pushed harder. And then, in late January, a state hydrologist flagged a problem with the drainage study. The spur route crossed a seasonal wetland that hadn't been adequately surveyed. New studies would be required, new permits, new timelines. The project was dead. Not officially, not yet, but it was bleeding out in a committee room in Olympia, and everyone knew it. I filed my final report in early February, recommending closure of the access spur pending further geotechnical review. And I submitted it with the same calm professionalism I'd used for every other report that year. No one questioned it. No one even noticed. And 2 weeks later, I received the map in the mail. The same laminated evacuation map I'd seen before, updated with a new line inked over in blue pencil. The spur was gone, erased. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I'd passed the final test, paid the final debt, and earned the right to step back into a normal life where my job was just a job and the forest was just a forest. I was wrong. The call came on a gray afternoon in late March, just as the first crocuses were breaking through the mud outside my cabin. It was the county dispatcher. There'd been an incident. A rain-on-snow event had triggered a debris flow in one of the northern drainages, and a family of hikers was stranded on a cut bank above the river. The water was rising fast. A log jam upstream was building pressure. They needed someone who knew the terrain. They needed me. I grabbed my gear and drove. The river was a nightmare, brown and muscled, full of broken trees and torn earth. It gnashed against the banks like something alive and angry. The rain was steady, cold, turning the world into a blur of gray and green. I found the family a quarter-mile upstream, huddled on a crumbling shelf of clay and gravel 15 feet above the water. 3 of them, a man, a woman, and a girl maybe 9 years old. The girl was clinging to a half-submerged alder, her legs in the current, her face pale with cold and fear. The man was shouting, the woman was crying, and the log jam upstream was groaning like a living thing, creaking and shifting, ready to let go. I tied off a rope to a cedar on the bank and called out instructions, my voice barely cutting through the roar. The angle was bad, the distance was worse, and the current was pulling hard, a cold hydraulic suck that would strip the strength from anyone who slipped. The girl couldn't hold on much longer. I could see it in her grip, in the way her shoulders shook. I waded in up to my thighs, the cold punching the air from my lungs, and tried to angle the throw. Once, twice. The rope fell short. The log jam groaned again, louder, and then I felt it, a presence behind me upstream, moving through the water with a weight that had nothing to do with current. I turned. He was there, chest deep in the river, his fur slicked dark and flat against his body, his eyes locked on the girl. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me. He just moved, angling his body across the current, using his mass as a breakwater, splitting the flow. The water shouldered around him, slowed, eddied, and in that moment of calm, I swung the rope. It landed true. The girl grabbed it. Her father grabbed her. And together, We pulled them across, first the girl, then the mother, then the father, hauling them up onto the bank one by one, soaked and gasping and alive. I looked back toward the river. He was already moving away upstream into the white water and the rain. For just a moment, he paused and turned his head. Our eyes met, and then he was gone. The family collapsed on the bank, coughing and shaking. The father grabbed my arm, his grip fierce. "Who was that?" he gasped. "Who else was out there?" I looked at him, looked at the woman, looked at the little girl, her lips blue, her eyes wide, and I made a choice. "I don't know," I said. "I didn't see anyone." That night, wrapped in blankets and shock, the father told his story to a county sheriff. He described a figure in the water, massive, impossible, moving like a boulder with intent. The sheriff wrote it down, radioed it in, and then, quietly, he pulled me aside. "You were there," he said. "You see anything like that?" I held his gaze and lied to a law enforcement officer for the first time in my life. "It was raining hard," I said. "Visibility was terrible, shadows everywhere. I think he saw a downed tree shifting in the current." The sheriff nodded slowly. He didn't believe me, but he also didn't press. "Funny thing," he said. "We get a report like this every few years. Someone sees something. Someone gets pulled out of something, and then the story just fades." He looked at me for a long time. "You know why that is." I didn't answer. He clapped me on the shoulder and walked away. 3 days later, the father called me. He wanted to go to the news. He wanted to organize a search. He wanted to prove that something had been out there, that his family had been saved by something real and extraordinary. He wanted my help. I met him at a diner in Marble Mount, bought him coffee, let him talk. And then I told him, as gently as I could, that going public would be a mistake, that the media would twist it, that the investigators would trample the area, that the people who'd come looking would destroy the very thing he wanted to protect. "If something's out there," I said, "the best thing you can do is leave it alone." He stared at me, his jaw tight. "You saw him, didn't you?" I didn't answer. He leaned back in his seat, his hands shaking, his eyes wet. "Why won't you tell the truth?" "Because," I said quietly, "sometimes the truth costs more than it's worth." He didn't go to the news. Instead, 2 months later, he took a job with the County Road Commission. 6 months after that, he filed a formal request to close a recreational access road near the drainage where his daughter had nearly drowned, citing safety concerns and erosion risk. The request was approved, and when I saw the closure notice posted online, I felt a cold, quiet certainty settle over me like a stone. He was in the ledger now, too. Spring turned into summer, summer into fall. I kept working, kept filing reports, kept moving the maps in small, invisible ways. I closed gates. I decommissioned spurs. I rerouted trails. I became very good at my job because my job was now something bigger than paperwork. And every few weeks, I would return to the amphitheater. The offerings changed. The objects accumulated. New photographs appeared on the shelf. Faces I didn't recognize but would probably meet someday in a diner or a planning meeting or a quiet conversation about the woods. I didn't see him often, maybe twice more that year. Once at dusk, on a ridge above the basin, standing in the last light like a monument. Once in heavy snow, passing between the trees, his shape already half dissolved into winter. He never approached, never called. He didn't need to. I already knew what was expected. The package arrived in late October, just after the first snow. Inside was the photograph, the one from the amphitheater, the woman on the footbridge. But this time it was whole, unburned. The torn edge from the fragment I'd found in the ash had been matched, fitted, made complete. On the back, in blue pencil, was a new drawing. The ridge, the basin, the circle. And inside the circle, a small, careful mark that looked like a handprint. Home. Protected. For now. I sat on the porch of my cabin, holding the photograph, and thought about the question the father had asked me in the diner. Why won't you tell the truth? The truth is complicated. The truth is that Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the old people, whatever name you give them, are not saving humans at random. They are not driven by kindness or curiosity or some noble impulse toward interspecies compassion. They are strategists. They have been watching us for generations, learning the systems we use to divide and dominate the landscape. And they have discovered something we like to pretend isn't true, that the most powerful acts are the ones no one sees, that a single closed gate can do more than 1,000 protests, that a misplaced file, a missed permit, a rerouted trail, a decommissioned spur, these tiny, invisible corrections can reshape the human world without anyone noticing until it's too late. They save the quiet ones, the fixers, the ones who would rather solve a problem than take credit for it. They rescue us from disasters, and then they watch patiently to see what we do next. And if we prove ourselves worthy, if we learn the language of silence and leverage, they add us to the ledger. We become the buffer, the living firewall, a constellation of indebted witnesses scattered across the map, moving roads and erasing lines and holding gates shut, protecting a sanctuary we can never acknowledge and a debt we can never fully repay. It is not a conspiracy. It is not a fairy tale. It is strategy, species-level survival, a mutualism bent toward the only outcome that matters. Time. Enough time to slip through the cracks we leave in the map. Enough time to raise young in the last quiet places. Enough time to endure in a world that is shrinking faster than we want to admit. They are not asking for proof. They are asking for silence, and in return, they give us purpose. I still work for the county. I still file reports and close trails and recommend hazard zones. I'm good at it. People trust me, and every so often, someone new joins the network. Someone who survived something they shouldn't have. Someone who saw something they can't explain. Someone who starts working a little differently, quieter, more careful, more protective of the margins. I recognize them by the way they hesitate before signing a permit. By the way, they route a new trail just a little bit farther from a sensitive drainage. By the small, deliberate errors that cascade into protection. We never talk about it. We don't need to. The ledger speaks for itself. Last week, I returned to the amphitheater. The quartz pebbles were still there, arranged on the stone shelf. The photographs, the glyphs, the raven's feather, and something new. A small wooden carving, no bigger than my thumb, shaped like a bird in flight. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. The detail was extraordinary. Every feather, every curve of the wing, carved with a patience I can barely imagine. I looked up, scanning the shadows, and saw him standing at the far edge of the clearing. He was older now. I could see it in the way he stood, one shoulder set slightly wrong from an old injury. The broken top he'd taken from me years ago in the lightning storm. His fur was more gray than auburn, his movements slower, more deliberate, but his eyes were the same, calm, knowing, patient. He placed his hand on his chest, then gestured toward the basin, then to the ground. Home, kept, for now. I mirrored the gesture, and then I added one more, hand to chest, then to the carved bird, then to the sky. I understand. I'll keep going. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then, for the first time since I'd known him, he nodded. Not a bow, not submission. Acknowledgement, respect, equals in a war that most people will never know is being fought. Then he turned and walked back into the forest, and I watched until his shape dissolved into the trees and the silence swallowed him whole. I'm telling you this now because the pattern is accelerating. The maps are shrinking, the roads are pushing deeper, the drones fly higher, the satellites see sharper, and the algorithms learn faster. The cracks we've been holding open are closing, and the countdown marks on the stone, 5, 4, 3, are not a myth or a metaphor. They are a warning. We are running out of time. Not decades, not generations. Years, maybe less. And the only thing standing between the last quiet places and total erasure is a network of people you will never hear about, doing work you will never see, protecting something they can never prove exists. I am one of them. And if you made it this far, if this story has found you, maybe you are too. Look for the signs. A closed gate that wasn't closed last season. A trail that's been rerouted for maintenance. A permit that gets delayed just long enough for the weather to turn. A parcel that gets pulled from a sale at the last minute for reasons no one can quite explain. These are not accidents. They are not bureaucracy. They are not luck. They are us, the quiet ones, the fixers, the ones who hold the debts and guard the doors and keep the maps just a little bit wrong, just a little bit incomplete. We were saved for a reason, and we are paying it forward, one invisible act at a time, until the ledger is balanced or the world runs out of margins to protect. I don't know how this ends. I don't know if we'll be enough, but I know that somewhere in the North Cascades, in a cedar amphitheater hidden beneath a lattice of bent branches and broken sightlines, there is a stone shelf covered in offerings, photographs and feathers and quartz pebbles, and the names of people who chose silence over recognition, who weaponized their gratitude into policy, who learned that the most powerful truth is the one you never speak out loud. And I know that if you go looking for proof, you won't find it, because proof would end everything. But if you go looking for purpose, if you're willing to live different, to become invisible, to move the maps in ways no one will ever notice, then maybe, just maybe, you'll find a quartz pebble waiting for you on a mossy stump, smooth and pale and impossibly deliberate. And you'll understand, the way I did, that you've been chosen, not for glory, not for fame, but for the quiet, invisible work of holding the line. The mountains are still there, the rivers still run, the old cedars still stand, for now. And as long as there are people willing to guard the margins, to hold the gates, to keep the secrets, maybe that will be enough. Maybe we'll buy them the time they need. Or maybe we'll just learn, finally, that some truths are too dangerous to speak, and some debts can only be repaid in silence. I still carry the quartz pebble in my pocket every day, a reminder of the choice I made and the choices still to come. And sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, I hear the drum. 4 beats, a pause, 4 beats, a heartbeat, a reminder, a promise. If you see something in the woods, something that saves you, something that shouldn't exist, don't tell anyone. Just live different. And when the time comes, when the map needs to be moved, or the gate needs to be closed, or the road needs to be quietly erased, do it. Not for recognition, not for proof, but because you owe a debt that can never be repaid, and because, in the end, that might be the only thing that matters.